Okay, we are live. It's 9 o'clock, and this is Senate Transportation Committee, and we're going to continue our discussion on the T bill that came from the House, and we have many different parts of it. And we're making progress every day, and Michelle is with us. And also, we have a special guest this morning. I think Trini Broussard is with us. I think Wednesday. Yeah, Trini Broussard is with us. I haven't seen her in a while. Michelle keeps her locked up over there at the state at the AOT, and so, Trini, good morning.
Morning, Senator Mazza. How are you?
Good, you?
Not too bad.
Well, that's good. You're going to talk to us about a railroad station, I believe, which there's a lot of interest about. And I know we've discussed it in Institutions Committee, and I see it's been on TV. There's a lot of effort going into it to move it and save it. So I thought, I guess you have the update on how we've been involved in that discussion. Is that correct?
I do. And as you know, I don't get involved in the things that are just easy and
usually. That's why you've been there for a long time. How many years you've been there now, Trini?
It was 30 in December.
Wow, we go back a long ways. God, yeah.
We do. Back to the days of public transit.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Well, I'm glad you're not retired like a lot of them are, so we can keep you on board.
Not yet.
Okay. All right. Would you like to tell us what it's all about? What's happening there?
Sure. So, as you know, we've been working on bringing Amtrak to Burlington. And part of that was a safety evaluation that was done of the track going from Rutland to the Burlington yard and looking at where we had conflict potential that really there was ways that we could address it and that we probably should. So you've seen projects come through the rail program for new crossings that have lights and gates. We've done some improvements to some structures. We're doing some stabilization work. And this station is one of the items that has been identified. So in this location, our challenge is sight distance and where the operator of the train needs to be able to see what's going on in an intersection before they get to it. And the location of this, when the train is coming from the north, headed southbound, they can't see what's in this intersection until they're actually in it because of the location of this building. So we looked at options and what we could do. Clearly moving the line became a big issue. So if you look at the diagram that Michelle just brought up for us, you'll see where the yellow star is the location of this. And so we looked at, could we put, where would we have to move it on site to be able to get the sight distance that we need? And so that pink square is where we would have to move it to get the sight distance. And you can see that the lower part of the image is in the wetland. And so we chatted with the folks over at A&R, and what they told us was the whole discussion of filling in the wetland begins with what the purpose of the building is. And because the purpose of the project could be accommodated somewhere else, we would have a almost impossible chance of pulling the permit to fill in that wetland to move that building back where it currently is. So also on this slide, if you look right near that building, you'll see where it gives us some of what our site distances are. So you can see in some cases we have 15 feet, 50 feet, 60, 100. They're very low numbers. And in the bottom right, the table will show you kind of what we have now and what the standard is in the MUTCD. So you can see we should have 1,445 feet of sight distance at this crossing for it to be ideal. We do not have ideal sight distance at a lot of our crossings just because of the topography. The railroad came through Vermont following rivers in lots of areas, so they're kind of twisty turny. But when you've got 35, 50 feet versus 1445, that's pretty drastic. And so these ideal site distances are with Amtrak coming through here at 59 miles an hour, which is the proposed coming from Rutland all the way to Burlington. And we want to be as close to that as we can to keep on-time performance and to stay competitive with cars and buses to get to these other locations. So this slide will show you where our right-of-way is. So the yellow line depicts where the state owns or property there. And we kind of looked at, could we flip it to the other side of the tracks? And the answer to that is no. This business that you see here is Phoenix Feeds. It's a dairy feed business. But the kind of area that comes out in kind of a funky shape on the opposite side of the tracks, you'll see two white tanks there in the image. They transloaded 38 cars there last year. And a lot of what they bring in there are like oversized components to the power grid. They bring in some calcium chloride, a variety of things. And there is a rail spur in there, although it does not show up very good at all in this image. So the activity that we're currently doing out of there, the railroad looked at it and there is no other location to do it for that. And then you see all these nice little green things, that's wetland. So, you know, the majority of what's in that is wetland, the opposite side. We ran into wetland in the majority of the area right at that crossing to look at any type of relocation. So then we come to what do we do with it? Where do we move it and how do we get there? So VTrans, I have personally been at the table for all except for the very last meeting of the group that's the Regional Planning Commission and the local select board are working on. And they narrowed down to 3 locations that they could relocate this building to and keep it there. And so their first choice in priority order is to move it to where you see the red dot and the number 1. And that's pretty close to where it is today and would allow it to stay in the same corridor. But we would need to purchase the property and do all the infrastructure under it. So it would need a foundation, a road, water, sewer, power, all the utilities installed there with it. And right now what we're waiting on is uses. So when you look at this, there's a variety of funding available out there that would allow us to use federal dollars to do some of this, but eligibility is defined by use. So what we've talked to the town about is let's figure out where we want it and what we want to use it for. And then we can all team up on securing the federal dollars as much as possible to pay for the cost to move this structure. Right? So if I'm going to use it as a personal home, I'm probably not going to find too many public dollars available to help me. But if I'm going to use it as you know, a visitor center or some type of transportation use, then there's a couple of funds in transportation we can use it for. You know, one of the discussions was moving it to the fairgrounds, in which the Agency of Ag had some grants they could bring to the table to help this. You know, if it's considered public infrastructure, Northern Borders grants are eligible to pay, I believe it's 80 or 90% of the cost in this part of the state. So what we are trying to do is figure out location, cost, and use so we can try to put to use a lot of the federal dollars that are rolling into the state right now as a way to pay to move this. The other two locations that they narrowed in on are closer to their kind of village area. And they would be used, one of them, I believe, is on their bike path. And the other one sits next to their town offices. But this is their preferred location right now. We have done a preliminary look at what would be required. This is the only one that would require an 1111 permit, but we don't see any issues with that. It's not in the wetlands. There doesn't appear to be any out of the ordinary ones that would be required from A&R. So this image is kind of what it would look like. And that's showing a parking lot and the building sitting on the corner there.
Trini, how would they go about a building that old? They really could move a brick building. It wouldn't crumble when they went to move it. Is it impossible or no?
Well, we've had two different companies that that's what they do, is move buildings, and both feel that it could be secured and moved.
Wow. It's amazing when you look at it. Yeah, go ahead, Senator Ingalls.
And Trini, I just a comment. I know it's tough. We put bridge pylons right in the middle of a lake, and to move a building the width of a building and to put a foundation in to ensure it and encapsulate it so it doesn't infringe on that wetland, it just doesn't seem to make sense to move it in any other direction than where it's at. And I know that's all been visited, but I can tell you, as a young man taking a job down in Brandon, Vermont, from a farm country and community, traveling that Route 7 corridor, the most thing that struck me was coming down that hill from north going south and coming down to that crossing and seeing that station there and seeing the tracks there. It was just really impressed upon me. Just out of anywhere on Route 7, that was just a spot that really kind of inspired me to even stop and look at what was there. But just a comment. I mean, I know you guys have done your due diligence. Just doesn't make sense that we can put a pylon in the middle of the lake filled with concrete, but yet we can't get permission to move the building one width, encapsulate that ground so it doesn't cause any problems. And I'd love to see it stay right where it was, but I'm done.
Thank you. You're right. We have looked at it, and we've met with A&R and had a fair amount of discussion about it, about actually how much would have to be filled in. And it's a fair amount of drop off there too. So there's a lot of stabilization, and it would be a pretty big project to create the space to move it, if you could even get the permits to do it. The Army Corps would be involved too, and we're not sure we could ever get that one. It's a tough one.
Yep.
This is an image of the ones in the downtown area where they were talking about potentially moving it.
Is there any thought of what they'd use it for? Would it be used for a welcome center or a historical, or a museum or something, or there's no talk about that yet?
There's a lot of discussion about it. There's not a lot of area in it. It's not a real big building. And they're having some pretty good conversation about it being kind of a combination museum and visitor center. So it would be open to the public, which it's not right now. And you'd be able to have folks come in and out and do their thing, which another reason it would be better if it wasn't right tight up against the rails.
So who's involved? Who's going to be involved in the cost factor? Is it going to be the town, AOT? And the cost going to be what? $500,000 to move it, or I have no. What's the estimate? It all depends where, naturally.
Right. So what we've looked at is what would the cost to move the building itself be?
Okay.
And we believe that would be in the $300,000 to $400,000 range.
Okay.
And then you've got the cost, if you have to buy land, that's an additional cost. We know there's going to be an expense to put a foundation under it. Does the site have utilities already? 2 of them do, 1 of them doesn't. So there's a cost associated with that. What we've been pretty clear to the town with is that we will be at the table and we will help them find the funding sources to make this happen. The town has been pretty clear that for them, they don't have the money to spend to move this building. And we've worked with Commerce. And, as I said, we had conversations with Ag, but I don't believe they'll be at the table if we use one of these 3 locations. But we're committed to helping put together a funding package that will make this move happen without it being a burden on the taxpayers of New Haven.
So there is a definite plan to move forward and move it somewhere then that at this point.
Correct.
Questions? Anything else, Trini, you want to add at this time, or is that pretty much cover it, or?
That's pretty much it. We are, as I said, we're committed, and we're also going to turn over every stone we can possibly find to try to make this a federally funded move as much as possible. And our secretary has committed to providing match funding on those grants.
Now, will Amtrak, just in case, which highly unlikely probably, the Amtrak comes sooner, what happens then? They can't come until the building is moved, or can they come prior to the building move?
Looking at timelines, we believe as long as we have a decision where it's going to go by mid-May, we'll be able to do all the efforts and hopefully have the building moved by the end of the calendar year.
Oh, okay.
That's what the goal is right now, so that it doesn't impact it. Worst case scenario, if we get delayed by a month or whatever, we would just have to put a temporary slow order in there for a while. But, just something we want to try to avoid if we can. But if we can't, we'll be able to handle it for a short period of time.
Okay, any questions from the committee? Anyone? Well, thank you very much for the update. Appreciate it. Thank you, Trini.
Yep.
Great. You guys take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, we're going to, we're moving right along. Next, we have, let's see, League of Cities and Towns. Gwen, welcome and join us this morning.
Good morning, everyone.
We haven't seen you this year, we don't have the opportunity. I bet you miss us terribly. It's been awful, huh?
Yeah, I'm surprised that we had to wait so long.
Yeah.
To see you. Normally we have local government day in February, but
Yeah.
that
Things
clearly
change.
didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, we've had some discussions around the league and issues. And so what would you like to discuss with us this morning? What?
So I assumed we, and for the 2 new senators,
Yeah, for the record.
I'm Gwen Zakoff from the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. I work with Karen Horn in the State House, the virtual State House as well, on all municipal issues, including transportation issues. So I figured today, since I've been tuning in, you had a question yesterday, Senator Mazza, about whether or not we would listen to these streams, and we certainly do.
Okay. Well,
Diligent notes. It appears that the committee has taken a keen focus on our funding and some changes made to 19 VSA 306 that are proposed from the House about Class 2 and town highway structure, appropriations and formulas. So I figured I could talk about that a little bit this morning. And I submitted written testimony. I'm not going to be directly referring to, but I encourage, just in terms of context, the committee to take a peek at it, at least some of the sections in the bottom where I refer to information that was provided to us from our communities. And when the House Transportation Committee was discussing town appropriations, they had asked the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, they'd asked us to reach out to our members to discuss with them town highway structures, class 2 roads, the grant funding amounts, the caps that are in place, the matching requirements, and just any sort of other general information that they thought was helpful. So included in my testimony is some of the responses from some of our communities. And so I would encourage folks to look at that. We had local officials testify in the House Transportation Committee, but unfortunately we haven't had that opportunity in your committee. So I'm hoping that at least that written testimony will suffice a little bit. It won't be perfect. It won't be exactly the same, but at least it's a way our local officials can get direct testimony into your committee. Okay, so with that,
have many towns said they don't want any more money this year?
yeah, they said,
Okay,
no,
I
yeah,
figure
we're all set.
with all the federal money that's coming in, I'm sure they've got more money they can spend.
Well, so since you brought that up, Senator, I'd really like to focus on that first then.
Okay, good. That's
So
good.
I think that the committee is obviously aware that we have the ARPA money that is coming to our communities, and there's been a lot of discussion about where it's going, how it's being spent, and what's going on. And I think your committee should be made aware that ARPA money by design was not to include transportation funding. So the ARPA money cannot be used for transportation. That is our understanding from the National League of Cities. It's our understanding from our congressional delegation. We cannot use that for transportation funds. We can use it for broadband. We can use it for other economic development things, other COVID responses, but not for transportation. And apparently this was done by design because of the infrastructure package that is coming down from the federal government. So we don't know exactly what that will look like in terms of how it will impact local governments, assuming that it will to a certain degree, but we just don't know what it looks like. So I wanted to put that on the table. I will have one caveat to that. Because the money in ARPA can be used for clean water, stormwater, we're hoping stormwater, but definitely clean water initiatives. There is a potential that the money can be used for projects that are included in the municipal roads general permit. So the committee might be familiar with the municipal roads general permit that was put into place for clean water projects along roadways, class 1 through 4 roadways that are municipally owned. So potentially you could be using it for some of those projects, but that being said, that's the only way that we're seeing it being applicable to transportation. So I just wanted to go on record.
So when you say not transportation, that means anything to do with transportation in the town, whether it's a culvert or anything to do with it.
It's the only, yes, but the caveat, the reason I mentioned the municipal roads general permit, the funding can be used for water projects. So potentially we have heard, and again, we won't know this until we get the treasurer's interpretation from the feds, but it could potentially be used for clean water projects, potentially. So it won't be used for like
free up money. That could free up money from the town from that project to put it back in transportation if they wish.
We don't know, but potentially. I just want to go on record as saying that it's not.
I'm curious how they could get around it. I'm sure there's some ways.
Right.
Senator Kitchell with us this morning? Oh, okay. I hope she's all right. Okay, I can't see her screen.
She's at the JFC meeting.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. All right. I know she had some questions on this, so all right, go right ahead. I'm sorry. Yep.
No, it's okay. No, I had hoped she had been here as well.
Yeah.
All right. So there was discussion yesterday in the committee about the $3 million appropriations, the increased appropriations to town highway aid. So I figured I would also start talking about that a little bit.
Okay.
The House committee had made that decision after we had, we provided our testimony and decisions were made, afterwards. The $3 million, obviously, we will take with open hands and gladly.
Well, surprises to me. Yeah.
I know, really surprising. And I think in terms of context here, the general town highway aid is the most flexible money that local governments get. It's also the most equitable. Every town, every city is going to be getting a smaller chunk of that money. The bill is, in our opinion, extremely clear that this is a one-time funding measure. This has no impact on the formula. This is not some guarantee that towns and cities will be getting any increased funding in further fiscal years. It's very clearly framed in that manner. it is shown as an increased gift for this 1 year. We fully support that. We encourage that. We think that is the most equitable way of getting money out on the ground. It is a chance for every town to have their say in how this money is spent in the most flexible manner possible. Now, the idea of moving it over into town highway structures or class 2 roads, we obviously wouldn't say no to that as well, but the issue being is that this is money that will only impact those communities that are on cycle to get funding for this year or for this coming fiscal year. So that will put a lot of communities out of that cycle. And as we've heard, as we were soliciting information from our members, it was actually really interesting to hear how long it's taken for towns to be on cycle to get funding for some of these programs. On average, the least amount of time I heard from any community, and it might be related to the district that they're located in, the least amount of time that I heard from a community that they're on cycle for is 3 years. The most amount of time that I've heard that a town is on cycle for is 8 years. Actually, in the town of West Fairleigh, we had heard from them that they were up for grant funding last year, but because there was that timeout last year because of COVID, they're pushing it out to 9 years. So there is significant amount of time between projects for grant funding for these projects, and I think that it's through no fault of V-Trans. I mean, the cycle is the cycle, and the projects are the projects. But as you've heard, and it's reflected in your white book, and it's reflected in the testimony from V-Trans earlier, that the demands are just outweighing significantly what's available to give to communities. Now, in terms of the Section 306 statutory references to the appropriations for Class 2 and town highway structures, the numbers found in that section of statute have been in that section of statute by my estimation, and I didn't get a chance to look at our statute's pocket part, which has the reference to when the changes were made in statute. But I do know that I was in the House Clerk's office when it was changed, and that was at least 12 years ago, because it was done by now current Senator Richie Westman when he was chair of the House Transportation Committee. And he left there in 2009, and I believe it was done a few years before that. So at least 12 years it's been since those levels have increased a single penny. So these increases to Class 2 and structures is, yes, it's an increase, but this is just a long overdue adjustment to the funding levels. And as everyone knows, everyone's singing the same tune, the cost of projects, the cost of materials, the cost of getting work done has significantly increased over the years, and particularly in the last decade. So the funding levels are obviously needed. The cost of projects are obviously needed. The increase from $175,000 maximum grant award to potentially $200,000 is a teeny tiny uptick in the cap amounts. We have heard from towns that, granted, there are towns, if you look at in the binder, in the white binder, there have the list of all the projects that are approved, obviously. So you can see some are really quite minimal, I shouldn't say minimal, small, but impactful from some of the smaller communities that are, maybe in the few $1,000s range. And then there's a ton that are, capped at that $175,000. Many of these projects are $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. So meeting the match amount and getting these awards is, towns are planning it through their budgetary process and their capital budget and making investments for future planning. And they're putting in a lot more skin in the game than what the projects are actually, what they actually cost. So they might be paying closer to 40, 50, 60, 65% of the project. I think that pretty much covers sort of the contextual, where we're coming from in relation to why we think that the increases in minimum appropriations is necessary, because it hasn't been done in over a decade, and that the minimum amount, the small adjustment to 175 to 200,000 also makes sense, because just the cost of projects being what they are. Initially, the House Transportation Committee was thinking perhaps closer to 250,000 when we solicited information and advice from our communities, they were thinking because of the cost of the project, so it should be closer to $250,000 to $300,000. Clearly that's not going to happen. So a $200,000 cap seems very small in relation to what actually probably should be happening. And then in terms of the $3 million, we just believe that it's the most equitable way to get money out to our towns in the next fiscal year for projects. And they can use it, again, if towns are paying 50% of some of these projects, there is a strong potential that this money, even if it's going for general town highway aid, will be used for structures, will be used for class 2 paving. It could be used for any of those projects as well. And there's a strong likelihood that it will be, but it also guarantees that smaller communities that generally aren't on cycle and might not even be vying for class 2 or structure grants. Some communities don't even vie for those grants or not even a part of that cycle. They will be at least getting some portion of that increased funding.
So I sense that you're agreeing with the House proposal of the $3 million for town highway grant added to the 27 million. Senator Chip?
Yes, we do. And I think it's a little, your committee unfortunately hasn't heard from our local officials. So I think the House Transportation Committee got a better understanding of sort of contextually why these requests were made from our communities.
Okay, Senator Chittenden, you had a question?
I was going to ask this question before Senator Kitchell showed up because I'm sure she already knows this and I didn't want to waste her time, but I was going to ask a little clarity on the town highway versus moving it to 2 million in structures and 1 million in the class 2 highways. Did I hear you say that you'll take the money, you're fine with that, but I'm trying as a new senator and trying to learn the lingo of this, what that translates to, what the implications are, what the benefits are to the state in moving them into structures in class 2 highway, and how that can either be a frustration point or at all problematic for our towns and cities across the state. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the difference, the trade-offs between those two?
Well, I think that we're going to have a very different, perhaps, opinion than the agency. So I think getting the agency's perspective on why they might agree with putting it in the actual grant programs would be more appropriate. Our position is that it's just the most flexible and most equitable way of getting money out on the ground, but perhaps the agency feels like it's more targeted in their own overall infrastructure planning for the state to do it more targetedly through structures or class 2. I cannot speak for them, however.
Senator Kitchell has joined us. Senator Kitchell, I know this has been an interesting discussion on your part yesterday. So,
well, it is because I see it as part of a larger discussion around even back to last year when how we use these federal monies, and one of the values was to spend the money where we get the best long-term investment. And so I think what we're hearing here is not disagreeing from a town perspective. It would be everybody should, it's sort of like everybody shall get something. On the other hand, we had this debate as it related to grants for businesses and the extent to which everybody gets something is not particularly strategic. And should we be using funds in the most strategic way? And yes, that does mean that if you do, then you're establishing sort of a hierarchy of need and aligned with that longer term value statement of long-term investment. So I think what we're seeing here is not an issue of understanding. It's around the policy difference in terms of how federal dollars should be spent. And that's why the governor has stated, certainly on numerous occasions, the same desire to use funding for these long-term investments, not sort of the more ad hoc kind of approach. And so for me, if you were listening to our discussion, it's really one of how do we take the money and use it in the most strategic way to improve the overall transportation infrastructure, whether it be state or local. So that's my only, that's how I am coming to this discussion. And that is, does everybody get something, or do we want to be strategic in how we make these investments for the long term? So that's that. I'm sorry I'm late. I just got out of joint fiscal, so I'm coming to the discussion. But to me, this is a policy decision that is guiding how we're making decisions around millions of dollars that are flowing.
So follow up, if I may.
yeah, go right ahead, Senator Chittenden.
So currently in towns and highways, it's to everybody gets some. It's a formula where the cities are getting, everybody's getting a little bit. If we move it to highways and structures, that formula goes away, and then it's just VTran. No, okay, so there's still a Senator Perchik just said no. So even if it goes to class 2 and structures, there's still a formula where towns are eligible for a certain proportion of that. Okay, and then my next question is just in what context do we usually use this proportional allocation versus when do we do it on a needs-based assessment with, and I'm guessing that's how grants usually work. The grants assess the needs. And I was thinking that the structures in the class 2 highways would be more grants-based rather than formulaic, but Senator Perchik saying, no, that's not the case.
No, that's not. What I was saying is that the formula will still be there. The towns will get their formulated grants. What the House says is like, we want to add to that, do a bonus of $3 million spread with the formula. Remember, we heard the other day that some towns get $300 because they really don't have very many miles, and other towns will get tens of thousands of dollars. So the formula would still be there. The base grant would remain. What the House said is add to the base grant for one time. And what we were talking about is keep the base grant as it is. They would get what they got last year for their miles per road, but this year put it into those competitive grants, the structures in the town highway.
Jane, Senator Kitchell, she also explained that that ARPA money can't be used for transportation. It has to be used for water or sewer or.
No, it probably can be.
It can be used for transportation?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, so that would help us if we understood that. Can they use that money, or how is it going to be used?
Well, we're in the process of making that decision, but I need to go back.
Because that's a big factor there. If they can use it for, there's a lot of money coming in there.
Oh, you're talking about the 1.75 million that's going directly to towns.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I think that, and I think the league is probably the most conversant on that, because that they can look at that section, but of how that money, and I think.
Well, Gwen, you said it couldn't be used for transportation needs. It could be used for other issues. Is that correct?
Our understanding is that it cannot be used for transportation unless it relates to clean water, basically like water infrastructure. So potentially it could be used for municipal road general.
That's what I thought you had said. Okay.
So it could be used. It could be used for roads if it's to meet the standards. And is that what you just said?
Well, so again, as you know, the information provided from the congressional delegation is what they have, and it says, broadband and water infrastructure. Now, it doesn't even say stormwater infrastructure. It doesn't say particularly how that water infrastructure is, but we're hoping and assuming that there will be a liberal interpretation of that, where by our smaller communities that might not be able to use it for broadband and other economic initiatives would be able to use it for their municipal road general permit projects. But that's still, we don't have that information yet. That is our understanding currently, but I can't speak for how JFO is understanding this or how our congressional delegation might have a new interpretation, but as far as we understand, that's what we were told.
I know that, well, go ahead, sorry.
Well, I was going to say, we all know that things get swapped out, money's fungible.
Yeah, and I know in some of my small area districts that are in the middle of nowhere, and we're all hoping for broadband to be there at some point in time. But they have more needs for road projects than they do of anything, and so that's going to be very problematic for a lot of my small towns to try to decipher what it can be used for. I mean, there's going to be enough money there that is going to be in limbo if they can't use it for road projects. So it'd be nice to be able to have that figured out.
Yes, Gwen.
I know that there's transit money in there, but again, that's not money that we could use. And not we could use it. Some of our communities could use it, but it's not generally what our towns need.
Yes, Senator Perchik.
On the equity kind of question, even though only some towns that are on the kind of cycle would get it, it would move the cycle up. So it would help those other towns, even though some towns would get money next year I still see it as benefiting all towns because it just moves up all the projects to a quicker time. So it does, it's not as direct, but it does help all the towns because it'll just get through more of the projects next year. And so instead of waiting 4 years, maybe you only have to wait 2 years to get.
Does anybody know what position it would change if there was money allocated? How many towns would benefit? How many towns, if there was extra money in that fund? Is there any estimate, like 10 towns or 4 towns or 21 or
What's
Is
the,
it 45?
45 towns?
what's the annual budget now for?
Yeah.
Senator Mazza.
Yes, go right ahead, Michelle.
Well, if you took the 3 million and divided it by 175,000, it's about 17 towns that would move forward more quickly. And you'll recall that we've also doubled the amount of town highway aid for, excuse me, not town highway aid, the structures grant program and the class 2 paving program, more than doubled them for this year so that we can make up for last year and keep things moving ahead. So I think there's about 15 million for those 2 programs in the proposal. So I think we're slated to make pretty good progress with that additional 3 million as well.
Yes, Gwen?
I sometimes I feel like I have to be like the Lorax for the smaller communities. And so, I think it's worth noting it when we're talking about the equity issue. I think you'd be really hard pressed to find a lot of communities that are squandering their federal or their state monies for transportation projects. I think that the money that might be available for employee issues, for lost wages and whatnot, that could be used for road crews or something. There's money to adjust in other areas, but I think that generally speaking, when there's any increase in any general aid, it's going to be put to good use. And again, like I said, it could even be used for the matching money or for the overall cost of these projects, which are huge. So, and again, there are communities that really aren't on cycle for either of these grant programs and that are just not a part of the mix. And as Michelle had mentioned, we are getting, and again, we are not ungrateful to these increases of monies, and we are very, very thankful. It's more of an issue of how we can get it, as I believe the House was saying, getting the peanut butter on the bread spread evenly, and making sure everybody benefits from this. So I think that it can go. On paper, it might not appear as targeted as the state perhaps would like to see it, but I think any investment into our infrastructure and our transportation infrastructure systems in general is money well spent. And with this, it's a policy decision you need to make. We won't say no to either money, but we just have to really have a strong voice for our smaller communities who are not a part of these competitive grants because they just don't have the capacity to do it, and they don't have the size projects that is necessary to even justify going through the process.
That's why the flexibility in the ARPA money coming out through is so very important, Gwen, because you're right. Those smaller communities just don't have most of them don't even have the matching funds. They just don't have the ability. They don't have the person power to put this stuff together, to even apply for it in most parts, or to do it in a timely fashion. So the flexibility of this ARPA money is going to be very, very crucial to some of these longstanding projects that these people wish to not even retire, just to start and get ahead of the curve. Are we still on track for May 11th? Is that when that ARPA money was going to be announced and the use of how towns can use it?
That was, as far as we understand, that's the date we've heard, and it hasn't changed as of yet. From the agency administration, we had a phone call with them 2 days ago, and that we're still on target with that.
One thing that I'd also bring up, Senator Ingalls, and it's in the budget. It's mind, I don't know, boggling, I guess, to keep it all straight. But in the budget, there is also additional money of $75,000 to each RPC to help with additional workload associated with that. This is on top of the 300,000 we had in 315 to help towns with, and then we had money that went to the league as well, that's going out to the league to work with towns to make sure that they're using the money in compliance and, meeting the requirements, but also helping them think through how to make the best investments. So your concern about the small towns and the capacity they have, I think, is recognized by putting some additional funding into these regional entities that do a lot with the with transportation, but other planning as well. So I just wanted to bring that up to say those resources to towns have been beefed up in both 315 as well as in the budget we're working on.
And I hope it's clear when it comes out to what can be used for. I mean, the amount of emails I'm getting right now is again mind-boggling from people who are just struggling to hang on to their underperforming wastewater treatment plants to just a bunch of projects without going all through every email that I'm getting. So the flexibility in these funds are going to be very, very important.
Look at this list that they published of all the towns, how much they get, and it ranges anywhere from $2,000 to $20,000 and $9,000, $16,000.
Yeah, that's just on the 3 million, right? Just
That's
on the
right.
3
That's
million
right.
fund. And I have that as well. I'm talking
Yeah.
more of the ARPA funds that are coming in, where
Yeah.
some of the towns are getting from $100,000 to $700,000 to be figured out on how that's going to be able to be used, which hasn't been. The list hasn't been published. It hasn't been determined yet. Welch's office sent out a rough draft of some of our towns on what they were expected to receive. So again, the flexibility and the guidance will be very important for us.
Senator Mazza?
Yes, go right ahead, sir.
I have a question for Michelle, but Gwen might know too. Like, how many towns don't participate in the competitive, either the class 2 or the structures grants? Like, are there a lot of those of the whatever 259 towns do we have? A big bunch that don't ever muster an application?
Senator Perchlake, I've actually asked staff to assemble the data relative to the awards and the awards cycle. In hearing Gwen talk about the fact that some towns don't get awards and once every 8 years or so, I wanted to understand that better, because the number I have typically heard is about every 3 years. And so what we can do is also clarify which towns have never had awards or don't seek them maybe in the past 10 years. So I'll have that data for the committee as well.
All right, that would be great. Thank you.
Any other questions at this time on this issue? It certainly has had some discussion about it, and
just one last
yes,
comment on the ARPA funds. Just one last comment on the ARPA funds. I'm looking at a spreadsheet here that, I mean, as I understand it, the money can be used for aviation and transit issues. So I think that perhaps the committee getting a better understanding of that would be really helpful. And as we are understanding, the money that's going, quote unquote, directly to towns and cities will have to be under these same sort of standards as well. So we also will not be able to use it for things other than transit and airports and whatnot. And again, potentially water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure. Our fingers are crossed that will be a possibility. But as far as we know, that's not going to be expanded beyond for transportation beyond this. And so the agency can speak better to what's being called the Biden administration's infrastructure plan that's coming up forward. So potentially looking forward, there will be money for transportation projects in that. But again, the potential for them to be very flexible and used in the manner that we would like them to be used for local government projects might not even be there. So that's why I think when we kind of carpe diem, when we see extra money on the table for the most flexible spending areas, I think that's why we kind of stick our neck out far for our smaller communities and say, you know, when it happens, we have to seize the day, because it doesn't happen very often that we get extra money on the table to be used in this manner. And so we thank the committee so much for listening to us today. And again, please look back to my written testimony that I submitted for some just sort of narrative about what some of our communities have said. Thank you.
And before we end, is there any other issues that you have heard that involve the league that you're interested in discussing with us at this time? I mean,
since you asked, you know, speaking to the H433 in total, we support the bill and all the extra investments into energy efficiency projects. You know, that's reflected in our own policies, and I know our communities are really excited about that. So we support the bill, you know, overall as presented, and we thank them and thank you folks. And in terms of the other thing I just wanted to mention in terms of town highway weights on our roads and stuff, I know that's the perpetual issue that's coming around, and we're kind of excited to see how the rollout for the DMV's permitting, you know, commercial permitting system manifests, and see how towns and cities can tie into that system to make things, you know, easier for everybody.
We're continuing our discussion on Woodstock, as you know, and we want to make some changes there because we don't think it's fair to the other towns in Vermont. So I don't know.
We have no comment on that.
Yeah, you have no comment. You're staying clear of that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, but I just want to make that known because we've been, you know, it's not that we have other communities that share some of the same problems, but they have not.
Yeah, we're going to focus on the overall road weight limits.
Yeah, thank you. That's you're trained really well, I'll tell you.
Oh, no. Oh.
She knows how to handle those questions. All right. Any other questions for Gwen at this time or this subject? If not, thank you very much, Gwen, for coming. If you hear of anything that pops up, give us a shout, okay?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay. Okay, committee. I think we're going to, our next item is at 10:15. And so Liz, if you take us off live for a moment.